peace and blessings. Habari Gani, Hotep. Many thanks, Chief O'Day, for the introduction. Shout out to Kimbunga Media, and most importantly, shout out to this esteemed brotherhood for the opportunity always to just reason with like-minded brothers and to continue spreading the good message of Garveyism and all that it entails. My name is Sam P.K. Collins. I'm a grassroots journalist, educator, and author based out of Washington, D.C., what I like to call Banneker City. Today's presentation is the second presentation that I've made as a part of this initiative, and we're getting a bit more domestic. The U.S. government versus Black people. Again, this is a Garveyite analysis. Before we move on, I just want to preface this by saying that I'm an 80s baby, 90s kid. So I was born in 89, raised throughout the 90s and the 2000s. So this presentation is near and dear to my heart because I grew up through these times. And I grew up as a first generation American, somebody whose parents came from Liberia, which at that time was experiencing civil war. So a lot of the striver conversation that was happening in my home was happening in other Black homes, even as we were dealing with the effects of the crack war and whatever else. So you're looking at this presentation in that context. And, all that you're going to see today will, I hope at least, further affirm the need for us to come together as one and to practice the tenets of Garveyism in real time. So without further ado, here's my presentation. You guys are definitely in for a treat. Yes, I. So this is pretty much the Garveyite analysis, U.S. government versus Black people. Don't get it twisted. It's still happening to this day. Next slide, please. So this presentation, as I was saying before, it aims to examine the effects of the Clinton administration, the Bush 43 administration, and the Obama administration as it relates to domestic policy with Black people. This will be done from a Garveyite perspective, meaning that we are assessing how Black people fared collectively, regardless of class, ethnicity, or whatever else, but especially class, regardless of class. We are going to examine how the Black family collectively fared under these three administrations. And before we move on, I just want to credit this photo. I got it off of Wikipedia this morning, but this was from the Million Man March in 1995. The Million Man March, under the leadership of Minister Louis Farrakhan and several others who he collaborated with, took place on the National Mall in DC, and it was in response to the very same issues that we continue to face today. So even as we saw Black faces in high places throughout the Clinton, Bush 43, and Obama administrations, the masses of Black people were still suffering in terms of economics and their relationship with the law. And Minister Louis Farrakhan called out millions of Black people to speak to that or to press for that in October of 1995. So we're definitely going to move on to the next slide. So who's a Garveyite? According to Tony Martin, a Garveyite espouses three principles. We went over this last time. There's a race-first allegiance, first of all. So an allegiance to the Black race, just as other races practice. There's also a spirit of self-reliance, kujichagulia, self-determination. So to what degree are we as a Black nation developing and patronizing Black-owned, Black-operated institutions? And to what degree are these institutions serving the collective need of the Black masses? And finally, last but not least, nationhood, the creation of a Black nation on the African continent. For the purposes of this presentation, and as I always do, and as I would expect anybody else to do, we are going to look at Africans in the United States of America as a nation within the nation, just as Martin Delany did, just as the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey did, just as Malcolm X did, just as the provisional government of the Republic of New Africa did. We are a nation within a nation. So that's going to be the framework for this presentation. Next slide, please. So we're going to start with the Clinton years. We're talking about 1993 up until 2001 into the 21st century. We are going to touch on Reagan and Bush 41 during the panel, but I just want to set the stage for what happened during the Clinton presidency. Clinton came in not too long after the fall of the Soviet Union. So from World War II up until the early 1990s, the United States and the Soviet Union were going toe-to-toe in what was called the Cold War. This was when they were stockpiling weapons. This was when they were engaging in proxy wars with Cuba and just whoever else. And the African world felt that because depending on who they pledged allegiance to, that dictated their relationship with the United States and whether or not their governments got toppled and disrupted. But with the fall of the Soviet Union, the United States assumed a position in the global hierarchy as the end-all be-all and as a model for Western liberal democracy. So what you can see throughout the 1990s and beyond, at least until September 11th, was Americanism revitalized, where America, like I said before, was the standard bearer of what it meant to be a global citizen. And with that came African Americans or Africans in America as it relates to culture, politics, and whatever else, assuming positions of their own. So on the surface, the Oprah Winfreys, the Eddie Murphys, the Magic Johnsons, the mavens of industry in all segments of society were becoming Black. But that doesn't mean that Black people were in the masses, in the lower classes, were faring just as well. And this presentation is going to speak to that. And I want you to pay attention to one thing at the very bottom of this slide. With Americanism assuming this new place in the world as the standard bearer of what it means to be a global citizen, with that came an emphasis on work ethic, Protestant work ethic at that, and law and order. And we see two of these themes permeate throughout Clintonian policies of the 1990s. Next slide, please. So before I move on, we gotta, once again talk about the Black folks that were peppered throughout the Clinton administration. He named at that time what was considered the highest number of American Africans to his first term cabinet. One of those figures is pictured here, the late Ron Brown. We also have Mike Espy, who was the Secretary of Agriculture, Hazel R. O'Leary, Secretary of Energy, and Jesse Brown, Secretary of Veterans Affairs. Next slide, please. But all the while, with Black people assuming high positions of power within the U.S. government and within the private industries, the masses of Black people were still suffering. And Clinton's economic policy on Black people, during that time, the poorest of us experienced a decline in income as the wealthiest of us saw the income increase. So the gap between the Black and white median income grew even wider during the Clinton period. And Clinton's economic policies, while people deemed them as better compared to Bush's, those economic policies did not change the overall economic conditions of Black people because they did not take into account factors and just situations that were already put in place before Clinton came into office. And those factors are called spatial mismatching, income and employment inequality, workforce discrimination, and poor education. And this was especially the case in portions of the South that had not been touched by industrialization. So our brothers and sisters in the Delta regions and in other parts of the South were still living in the 1950s and 60s, even as the more affluent of us were assuming positions of power in this country. And then we take the welfare reform. So let's keep this in mind, and this is not to put it all at the feet of the president. We are in the U.S. government, which has three branches of government, with journalists being the fourth branch or the fourth estate. But the three branches of government are the executive, the judicial, and the legislative. So as far as Clinton's policies during that time, one can argue that to some extent he was influenced by the Republican majority that controlled both houses during what was called the Republican Revolution. But as you'll see with President Obama, Bill Clinton was a centrist. And oftentimes in American politics, in order to make it to the plateau of American politics, you have to be a centrist. A centrist meaning that somebody who is not too conservative or somebody who is not too liberal. So what often masquerades as liberalism in this country oftentimes is centrism. And that centrism uses Black people as a trump card in the sense that we are often traded politically to make deals that benefit the executive while benefiting the more conservative elements of the legislative branch. And that is exactly what happened during the 1990s. The Republicans, as the Democrats will tell you, they pigeonholed Bill Clinton into making these decisions. But Bill Clinton already had a conservative mindset when during the debates leading to his presidency, he said that he would end welfare as we know it. And he did that through between 1993 and 1996 when he replaced what was called aid to families with dependent children with TANF, also known as temporary assistance to needy families. And with that came an imposition on a 5-year lifetime limit on benefits. So no longer could people be on benefits throughout their life or intergenerationally. They would have to prove employment to get benefits, first of all, and then those benefits would taper off. This federal legislation that Congress conjured up and Bill Clinton signed was experimented on in different states. 43 of those states applied for waivers to adjust the previous program to make these programs more conservative. And this came out of the anti-poverty rhetoric that George Bush the first took on, Bush 41, as well as Ronald Reagan when he had trickle-down economics. In addition, Bill Clinton also expanded the earned income tax credit. Some people would argue that despite what he did for welfare, that the earned income tax credit was a benefit to a wide segment of American Africans. 1.1 million of those American Africans benefited because they had children and they had accumulated low to moderate income. To this day, and especially during the pandemic, the earned income tax credit has been a great saving grace to Black people. I know we have running jokes all of the time. During tax season, you take on people's kids or, parents. They might fight over who can claim which kid, but this is the reason why. The earned income tax credit benefited American Africans during one time of the year when they could claim children on their benefits or on their taxes and get that money back that they overpaid the government anyway. Now, in terms of the effects overall of the earned income tax credit, an analysis by Jacobin, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right, it found that the policy only helped the working poor and not the extremely poor, meaning that, again, a Protestant work ethic type of mentality that Bill Clinton and the Republicans of that so-called Republican Revolution had imposed made its way even into the tax policy. So once again, those of us who are generationally impoverished end up losing because we did not work out of what they thought was pure laziness, when in fact it was due to policies that were set up long before Clinton had come into office, that Clinton did not account for when he made this policy. And before we move on, you guys are going to see a constant theme, like I'm telling y'all again. American politicians, especially those who are from both parties, both majority parties, who rise through the ranks and become executives, they often make compromises and become centrist so that they don't have any need or they don't feel any need to take on the more liberal or what they deem the more extreme policy suggestions of those of us in the trenches. And Bill Clinton did just that. Okay, y'all, you guys are in for a woozy. Along with welfare reform, along with the income tax credit that did not work, Bill Clinton also exported factory jobs. He exported factory jobs and he shrank the size of government. Okay, these are two policies that affected American Africans, seeing as though since the Great Migration and since World War II, American Africans accounted for a sizable population or portion of the automotive industry's workforce in the Midwest. Those jobs got shipped to Canada and Mexico, and Black people suffered as a result of that. Once Bill Clinton shrank the government to save money, we're talking about the greatest reduction of the federal government not seen since John F. Kennedy's administration. That affected American Africans who had just started coming into the federal workforce. So these are the jobs that we depend on. And even as Bill Clinton's taking them, we look at him as the quote unquote first Black president because he plays the saxophone, because he got caught getting fellatio from Monica Lewinsky in the White House, in the Oval Office. But he did these things, and comedians led us astray, even as he approved laws and policies that decimated whatever chance working class and impoverished Black people had to make it in this country. And again, we're talking about the collective progress of Black people, not just those in his administration, not just those who interviewed him, who are in the same class as him, but the masses of African people living in the United States. Once again, we're coming to crime. Again, crime is an indication of the socioeconomic conditions that are at play. The more crime you see in the city, the more crime you see on Wall Street. The more crime you see in the city, in the streets, the more crimes you see in the White House and with the government that is entrusted, right? That is entrusted to help the people. And once again, with all of this criminality going on in the form of siphoning resources for the 1%, and while wagging their fingers at the lowest of us, Bill Clinton, again, working with the Republicans, imposed a crime bill. The infamous 1994 crime bill, which is 30 years old, it imposed tougher penalties for crimes, including the 3 strikes rule, and it also financed a prison industry boom. Another bill that Clinton signed authorized spending for 100,000 community police officers. Now, let me give y'all some context. By 1993, Los Angeles was already doing something similar. And Ronald Reagan, a movie star turned president, came out of, he might have been a governor at one point, if I recall correctly. He came out of California. Under Ronald Reagan's presidency, the mental health institutions got defunded at the state level. So with the closing of the mental health institutions, a lot of people who were diagnosed with mental illnesses, including Africans, were funneled into the prison system. And the crime bill here exacerbated the prison population, causing overcrowding and causing the creation of prisons, many of which are found in rural America. Rural America, majority white towns, right, that are far away from the city where these brothers and sisters are getting prosecuted. Once they get prosecuted and they go through the system, they're convicted, they're being shipped off to prisons that are being constructed in rural America where the COs and the prison wardens and just whoever else are residents of those white towns. So Bill Clinton, a white president, the so-called first Black president, worked with white Republicans, Newt Gingrich and whoever else, to boom the prison population. After decimating welfare, after shipping jobs out of the country, after creating tax policy that only skimmed at the problem and did not decimate it. Pitiful. Now we're done with Clinton, those 2 terms, and now we're on to the Bush. The second Bush, Bush 43, the more charismatic, but not as intelligent Bush, the Bush who was able to speak plainly, the Bush that became popular after 9/11 and leveraged that popularity to roll back a lot of the rights that we thought we could enjoy in this country. I'm going to look at Bush's policies in the realms of education, defense, economics, and emergency response when it comes to infrastructural deficits. So as you can see, between 2001 and 2009, when he came in, George Walker Bush, the son of George Herbert Walker Bush, had the highest and lowest ratings of any president in modern history. You're going to see why. No Child Left Behind. No Child Left Behind Act. This act was introduced into law in 2001 and 2002. I'm going to age myself a bit. I was a 7th or 8th grader around that time, and I was actually at an event where they celebrated No Child Left Behind. This law paved the way for school privatization because it tied the support that schools would get to the test scores that they had accumulated. So if you are a school that is already suffering, not by virtue of what students have in their capacity to learn or by virtue of teacher performance, but if you're a school that's suffering because of the circumstances of the neighborhood in which you are located, then you were the ones suffering the most with No Child Left Behind. Black teachers got replaced at schools because they lost their jobs. Schools lost funding because of No Child Left Behind. And the passage of No Child Left Behind aligns with the proliferation of teachers from Teach for America, a program through which teachers or college graduates can study teaching or be in the classroom for 2 years before coming in there full time. And oftentimes these teachers from Teach for America, they are often not Black. They're often white liberals or white conservatives from middle America or wherever else who come into majority Black cities, and they're teaching our children in public schools that are no longer getting funded because of No Child Left Behind. So with No Child Left Behind, not only came the decimation of the Black teacher force, but also came the privatization of schools through the public charter school movement. The charter school movement not only decimated our public schools, but they decimated our Afrikan-Centred schools. With the introduction of the public charter school system, parents who saw this alternative saw a need to no longer pay tuition at their Afrikan-Centred schools, but to enroll their children in these experimental public charter schools that turned out being just as worse in many cases, with no accountability to the government while they're getting public funds. And No Child Left Behind started all of this. For those of y'all who are old enough to remember, or cognizant enough to remember, there was an Atlanta cheating scandal where teachers took standardized tests and they went behind their students and changed the answers to tip the scales in their favor to make sure that their jobs were being saved. The focus on standardized testing not only exacerbated the education problem, it made it so that the children of today who are entering college don't know how to write. A lot of them struggle in the critical thinking part of the college curriculum, and a lot of them, most importantly, are not able to form their own opinions. So we are having a class of children who are being educated to be workers instead of critical thinkers. We are no longer reading the whole book. We are just reading passages because No Child Left Behind put an emphasis on testing and looking the part more so than changing the structural circumstances of what caused the so-called achievement gap. Oh man, going back to 9/11. 9/11 gave George W. Bush the license. And again, we're talking about the three branches and the fourth estate being the media, the New York Times in particular. They took George W. Bush at his word. They took the late Colin Powell at his word. They took Condoleezza Rice at her word. Condoleezza Rice and the late Colin Powell, both being Black people, Black faces in high places, orchestrating this scheme to send hundreds and thousands of soldiers over to Iraq and to Afghanistan on a mission that had no end in sight. And as he did that, George W. Bush's government launched the Department of Homeland Security, phone taps, and other schemes that were targeted at those of us who were practicing Islam. And if you're Black and practicing Islam, then you got it just as bad. And that was the case for Imam Jamil Al-Amin, also known as H. Rat Brown. From the time that he came home in the 70s up until the time of his reincarceration in early 2000s, he was a target of the US government, even though he had taken on what some might consider a less radical tone in his rhetoric. And he was speaking more about spiritual atonement. They still had his eyes on him, and to this day, he is serving life in prison for a crime that the evidence shows he did not commit. But what's even more interesting than the imam's incarceration was what happened before that, what inspired that. If you go to the Detroit area, Imam Lukman Abdullah, and this happened under the Obama administration, but that was a holdover from the Bush administration. The Secret Service or the FBI or the CIA, they were looking at this brother because they thought that he had connections to Al Qaeda or to any other terrorist, so-called terrorist organization. So we see an infringement on human rights being inflicted upon our people, particularly those of us who practice Islam, and this happened under the Bush administration. Another aspect of the Bush administration dealt with subprime mortgages. So President Bush II, he really prided his administration on boosting Black home ownership, and that's all well and done and true, but the circumstances of that did not do this country too well. When you give out loans to people who cannot afford to pay it back, and you have an economy in which the 1% are getting taxed much less than those of us on Main Street, then you're concocting a formula that will end up disastrous. And what came out of that was the Great Recession, during which those of us who bought homes with these crazy loans and whatever else and these interest rates, the values of the homes became lower than what we bought it for. That's what's called the house going underwater. So as the recession came, we lost our jobs, we had these mortgages that we could not afford to pay, and we were sitting on houses that had no value. The people who actually did that were the ones to blame, because for years, Wall Street was gaming the system. And under George Bush's watch, they did so with tax breaks, and they did so while giving us, who could not afford to pay for these houses in the first place, loans that were out of this world. Speaking of housing and speaking of Black people, of course, you have Hurricane Katrina. This happened during the Bush administration, and it happened right after the Bush administration rolled back 3 decades of environmental protections. Bush also faced criticism for not mentioning the disaster during his 2006 and 2007 State of the Union addresses. And as far as Katrina, the administration knew of its arrival and they did nothing. And they went on to deny their prior knowledge of that. Bush also failed to end his vacation to respond to that. And all while that was happening, Vice President Dick Cheney was trying to divert power from New Orleans hospitals to Mississippi oil machines. So with the Bush administration, more so than the other administrations, it was always profit over people. And neither Department of Human Services or FEMA acted quickly to rescue refugees. And quiet as kept, the Cuban government, with all that was going on between that government and the US, did more to help our people than the Bush administration did. And you'll see the same when it came to COVID, when it came to Ebola. The Cuban government oftentimes had its hand out ready to help those of us living here in the United States of America. But just so that you guys know, the Bush administration did not do much in terms of preventing Katrina or preventing the damage to Katrina, nor did they do much in terms of immediately evacuating and rescuing those thousands of African people. Just like Kanye said, Bush does not care about Black people. So that brings us into the Obama administration. And for those of y'all who were around during that time, it was quite a time to be alive. I was a college sophomore when Obama came into office. I did not run down to the White House with my friends. I was working that night, had to get some money. But what I saw during the Obama years, gentrification in the district, seeing as though thousands upon thousands of young multicultural professionals came into the nation's capital and they set up shop here to work in the Obama administration. I saw brothers cutting their locks because they saw a black man in the White House with whom they can identify. I saw rappers voting for the first time and espousing a future that they were hopeful for. Obama record will show that none of that quite came into fruition during his 8 years in office. And as liberal as Obama, or as some people thought Obama to be, because Obama, like Clinton, was more of a moderate, President Obama brought some holdovers from the Bush administration. See, when you're examining these heads of state, you can't look at them as the head. You have to look at who's around them, who's determining their policy, who are they working in alignment with. And President Obama held over the Fed chair, Ben Bernanke, who oversaw the Great Recession of the previous administration. He held over Defense Secretary Robert Gates, Sheila Bair of the FDIC, Ray LaHood, Transportation Secretary, and Francis Collins of the National Institute of Health. So these are holdovers from the Obama administration, and they to some degree determined the policy, at least of his first term. Speaking of the first term, and here I have to acknowledge Dr. Cornell West and Tavis Smiley. These two brothers here were supporters of Barack Obama. And people will try to tell you that they fell out of favor with the president because they were not invited to the inauguration or to the inauguration activities that you have to have a backstage pass for, whatever the case is. They will try to tell you that their critiques of the Obama administration were seeped in that. But that is far from the case, and that is due to my analysis. And no means am I a surrogate of either of these gentlemen, but I'm giving an analysis in the sense that, again, we're going back to a Garveyite analysis, a total examination of the collective well-being of Black people, right? Time and time again, we've had Black people in high places, but the rest of us did not fare too well during these times. And you'll see that even while running as president, President Barack Obama, while serving as senator representing Illinois, he did some work in the background, wheeling and dealing with his colleagues in the Senate and even in Congress. And he got enough votes. He secured enough votes as a senator to get a $350 billion bailout of the banks. A bailout meaning a cash infusion from the Treasury. The Treasury was approved by Barack Obama and his congressional colleagues to pour more money into the very banks that caused the Great Recession. And around that time, as he was doing that, those very same banks contributed $8 million in political contributions to his campaign. So before he came into office, Barack Obama showed his true face card in terms of what he was willing to do for the banks, and less so the people of middle and lower America. In the spirit of deficit reduction, President Barack Obama even worked with Republicans and Democrats of the conservative kind to pass a bill that made it so that he was no longer able to bail out homeowners. So these millions and millions and billions of dollars that are going to the banks, a lot of that did not reach the homeowners who had underwater mortgages and who were out of jobs during the Bush years. All of this happened during the first term of the Obama administration when the Democrats had the majority. Because mind you, the Democrats lost the majority during the midterm elections of 2009, but they had the majority before then. And Barack Obama still did this. Next slide, please. All right, we're going to Obamacare, also known as the Affordable Care Act. Big Pharma got his hands on it. You know, all throughout this whole campaign, we were talking about universal health care, you know, a one-payer system or one person, one healthcare system, whatever it's called. And the president did not make good on that. He made a compromise that he always does. And, you know, President Obama was never one to call himself a liberal. As a matter of fact, he was one that was always calculated. He spoke very calculated. He paused oftentimes when he spoke, and he made his decisions in the very same way. What you saw during those 8 years was a man who was afraid to step on any toes. And you saw that with the way that he had even abandoned Reverend Wright out of Chicago. The Reverend who mentored him, who, from my understanding, presided over his marriage with Michelle Obama, right? A guy who he looked up to. This was a guy who he threw under the bus when the footage of the Reverend's past sermons came out, in which he condemned America to damnation. Now, if you're a president, or if you're the first black president, or the first guy who looks like the first black guy who's looking like he's going to get close to the presidency, of course, you know, unless you go hard, you know, but you don't go hard, you're going to throw your mentor under the bus. Reverend Jeremiah Wright, he did that. They gave some indication of what Obama was going to do during his presidency. And he did just that with Obamacare, you know, wheeling and dealing with then Vice President Joe Biden on his side, trying to reach compromises. But what people don't understand is that when it comes to the political system, it is less so about the political parties and more so about the moneyed interests that are backing them. So the pharmaceutical industry could not stand to lose in this battle, which is why they infused dollars to make sure that the healthcare system was still working in its favor. So instead of people getting free healthcare, you had to buy into systems, right? Instead of, you know, everybody getting what they needed, there was still a way where at one point in time, people were being penalized by way of their taxes for not having health care. People were being forced into getting health care. My understanding is that years ago, the government did away with that. But even with what people may consider the best form of healthcare coverage this country has ever had, people's premiums were still too high. So even if you had coverage, either you had high premiums or either you took on plans that did not have much coverage, because the patchwork of the system was just that, a patchwork. It was not a nationalized system like what other countries see. And that's because Big Pharma wanted to keep it privatized, and President Obama not wanting to step on any toes within Congress or within a Big Pharma decided to keep it that way. And one more thing before we move on, we can keep it here, but before we move on, right? We're talking about public health, okay? Healthcare alone is not going to do it for Black people. We have to address the infrastructural inequalities, our lack of access to clean water, to clean foods, healthy foods, the high level of stress that we have in this country. We got to address all of that. And we have to make it so that we have more clinics in our communities where people can practice so-called alternative medicine, what I like to call natural medicine, non-Babylonian medicine. But without that, then this whole healthcare discussion is for naught. And the Obama administration did not really take too much part in that dialogue. The closest they did was when they attempted to discourage Black people from making emergency room visits. They tried encouraging us to, you know, go to our primary care provider to be preemptive instead of being reactive to illnesses. But even with that, that analysis does not take into account the intergenerational traumas that Obama's predecessors to some degree perpetuated when they passed laws and kept systems in place that kept us in communities that were making us unhealthy all along. So we're going to move on to police brutality. And this picture here is from the Beer Summit. So Henry Louis Gates, a scholar, well-known scholar at that, he was profiled at his home. This is the officer, if I remember correctly, who profiled him. President Obama, he spoke some truth. He called it a dumb decision on the part of the officer for profiling the doctor here. And he caught a lot of, fire for that. And Obama, always doing what he does, he took the middle road. He drew back that comment. And instead of tackling the systemic issue of police brutality, he held a beer summit. He treated this issue of police profiling as if it was a one-off, as if it was a situation that only affected one person, that it was an anomaly, when in fact it was a systemic issue that affects Black people and has affected Black people. But Obama did not take that into consideration, nor did he address that until well into the so-called Black Lives Matter movement, during which we saw African men and women standing up against the police departments in various cities throughout this country, United States. So what I will give the Obama administration some credit for was its Justice Department investigating 21 police departments. And those resulted in settlements and the monitoring of those departments. It also compelled some police departments to reach out for de-escalation training and others, and just other things to help them become more, friendly to Black people. But just as many police departments fought back against the Justice Department, and it got to the point where the Justice Department was accused of some overreach. So even as they attempted to secure justice, it just could not be done. And that was especially in the case of Mike Brown's death. Eric Holder's Justice Department did not find any reason to prosecute Darren Wilson in Mike Brown's death. He didn't find any indication that Mike Brown had his hands up when he was shot to the ground during that August day, which baffles me to this very day. But again, it shows the limits that it shows a limit to what President Obama was willing to do. And even as he did that, he vilified protesters. He vilified those who rightfully took their anger to the streets. And even as he did that, his FBI, in conjunction with the New Jersey government, increased the reward for Assata Shakur's capture. The same Assata Shakur that, held her own. She defended herself and was framed, and she escaped prison. And even as the U.S. government was negotiating the terms of its relationship with Cuba, there was some discussion about how to bring Assata back under the Obama administration. How's that for the first Black president? Just wait till you guys see what happens, because we're going to have the foreign policy part of this discussion in 2 weeks. Just wait till y'all see that, because that's even crazier. Next slide, please. The Flint water crisis. President Obama here, by the time this picture was taken, legions of African children in Flint either had ADHD, Legionnaire's disease, or any other kind of pneumonia or brain-altering ailment that was caused by the high levels of lead and chlorine that was in the Flint water supply. And by the time that Obama had come down to Flint, the EPA, known as the Environmental Protection Agency, had already known about what was going on in Flint. But it took a year for the administration to address it, to address what the United Nations had called a human rights disaster. And to this day, 10 years later, residents are still fighting for clean water. This is despite the water supply being turned back to a cleaner source. They're still fighting for clean water to this very day because of what the Obama administration and the state government under Government Snyder failed to do. So key takeaways for this presentation, and I'll preface my takeaways by saying that I could have gone in a lot more deeply. I went in as deeply as I could in the interest of time. But what I want everybody here to understand, and if we can go to the next slide, that Black faces in high places has never done us any good as Black people in this country. And what you'll see here, that in the Clinton, Bush 43, Obama era, it was an era of Black buy-in into the American dream. It was an era of Americanism where we were expected to practice color blindness, and where America was put on the pedestal of the world stage as the end-all be-all and the progenitor of what was right and what was wrong. So with that, there's a lot of envy for Black people in other parts of the world, and a lot of misunderstanding, as I define it, about the Black situation here. Just because we have our Oprahs and our Bob Johnsons and our whoever else does not mean that all Black people are doing well. And it does not mean that we are spoiled. We have more access to money, of course, but where does that money go? We're robbing Peter to pay Paul over here, because the policies of the Clinton, Bush 43, and Obama eras exacerbated the wealth gap, and it further emboldened Wall Street to close off the American dream, the so-called American dream, to the least of us. So speaking as a Garveyite, I have to say that this was not Garveyism at all, that it was the perpetuation of the same policies that have held the majority of our people back. And as we go further and further along in our history and into contemporary times, the powers that be are further positioning people who look just like us to make sure that we buy into these policies. And that is exactly what is continuing to happen. And as a matter of fact, I will end here by saying that the Obama presidency demolished any prospects. I wouldn't say demolished totally, but it further hampered efforts to promote nationalism among Black people. Because with Obama at the top, that signaled to those of us who are not too well versed in what America could do, that signaled for us some hope that we could make it to in this system, when in fact that is not the case. Because once again, when it comes to Garveyism, we're talking about the collective well-being of the Black nation in the United States. And collectively, we have not done good, and we continue to not do good. As long as, that's just the case. And I will end there. Sante Sana.